Hi friends, welcome back to Hebraic Creations. I thought we were going to be moving on to a new subject, but right after the last video I did about dietary laws, I came across some very interesting information in the news that I just had to share with you. Last time we talked about the possibility of the coronavirus being a consequence of disobeying the Torah as outlined in Deuteronomy chapter 7:15 and chapter 28 verse 58 to 56, which forbids eating abominations like rats, bats, snakes, pigs, blood, etc. The very day I posted that video, my sister forwarded me an article that reported that Smithfield Foods, which is the world's biggest pork processing plant located in Sioux City, South Dakota, was having a coronavirus outbreak. But the CEO didn't want to close the plant. He claimed that the food chain in the United States was going to suffer, seriously, over a lack of pork. Maybe it would be a good thing to end pork production in this country, and you'll see why in a few minutes. This is a China-owned company, and the management has had a history of employee abuses, which is really sad. Many of these people that work there are foreigners, they're refugees, and there must be like 70 different languages spoken in that plant. The CEO reported that Smithfield provides 18 million servings of pork a day to U.S. consumers. I just thought that it was interesting that the number signature there, 18, is 6 plus 6 plus 6. And the only reason why that caught my attention was because recently someone, another source had pointed out to me that the Black Death or bubonic plague ended about 666 years ago. I just thought that was a really interesting synchronicity. So how bad is the outbreak in this pork processing plant? Well, the percentage of confirmed cases of coronavirus in the United States is hovering around 0.2%, less than 1% of total population. The percentage of confirmed cases at this plant of 3,700 employees hit the news with 293 cases, which is 8%. That's an 8% worker infection rate. A few days later, it doubled to 16%. And now there's like 150 family members, relatives, and friends also infected. The company's now closed that facility, and I think a total of 5 plants so far across the United States, but not without complaining. A Forbes article by Alexandra Sternlich is claiming that the U.S. meat processing plants are becoming the new coronavirus hotspots. An 18% infection rate, like in South Dakota, is 90 times higher than the national rate of infection. I just felt like this was a confirmation of what I was sharing last time, that there are potentially lethal consequences to disobeying the Father's dietary instructions. It's important for us to avoid animal source foods that are, number one, an abomination to Yehovah, which includes things like pigs and snakes and rats and things like that. And secondly, it's really important that the animal source foods be properly handled. These factory farms and slaughterhouses are a problem. Kosher slaughtering, on the other hand, avoids these problems because they have a quick cut to the neck, which is humane, and it allows all the blood to drain out quickly. Whereas modern slaughterhouses, they use stun guns to kill animals, and the blood is immediately coagulating in the veins and flesh, making it completely unfit for food. Even hanging up the carcass upside down does not help at this point. Also, carcasses are contaminated with stress hormones and feces and other body fluids. U.S. slaughterhouses have some major problems, but they are not like the wet markets in foreign countries where live animals of every conceivable species are commingled and animals are slaughtered right there in front of the customer with blood and guts going everywhere. In some markets, it's even customary to twist animal necks to hold the blood in to make the meat more juicy and flavorful. Today, studies have shown that blood is a very dangerous body fluid. Not only is it life-giving to creatures, but it also gives life to viruses, parasites, and other dangerous pathogens. When that gets passed around to other humans and animals, it can lead to sickness, disease, and death, especially if transmitted from unclean animals. You know, I used to think blood was only consumed by occult groups or really desperate, sadly, third world peoples, till I traveled to Ireland, where a lovely inn served us a breakfast that included this dark-colored little disc called black pudding. I was concerned it was pork sausage, so I questioned the waitress, and she said, "You don't want to know. But it tastes good, so don't worry about it." Well, I insisted, and she admitted that this little delicacy was made of pork blood. Blood was bad enough, but pork blood to me was double trouble. In Isaiah chapter 66, verse 17, the prophet links the consumption of swine flesh to abominations and idolatry. In Leviticus chapter 17, verse 14, and in Genesis 9, verse 4, Yehovah says, "You shall not eat the blood of any flesh, for the life of all flesh is in the blood." This is repeated every which way from verse 10 through 15 for emphasis. When the coronavirus first appeared in the United States, I began reading the book, The Coming Plague: Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance by Lori Garrett. This is not a Christian resource, and it's not a diet-focused book by any means, but it is convincing me that many of the virulent or contagious sicknesses today originate with unclean meat consumption. Although countries around the globe have no qualms about serving up rats, dogs, horse, snails, etc., our biggest stumbling block, I think, in the United States has probably been pork. By now, many of you have heard of the horrible pandemic in 1918 to 19 that sickened over 1 billion people worldwide and killed more than 21 million. In 1935, Richard Shope did experiments where he concluded that that pandemic was an H1N1 virus that was traced to swine. In 1976, fear of a repeat of this horrible pandemic led President Gerald Ford to sign the National Swine Flu Immunization Program. That was Public Law 94-380 if you want to look it up, which ended in a disaster. The cure was worse than the feared plague itself, with millions of taxpayer dollars spent on vaccine injury lawsuits and settlements after the feared pandemic never materialized. But there have been plenty of other plagues since then. There's so many, it's mind-bending. There are New Testament passages that address eating abominations, in particular blood. And I just want to go over this one. It's in Acts chapter 15 and I believe chapter 21. This is where the Jerusalem Council outlines 4 things Gentile converts should avoid. Number 1, sexual perversion. And that includes human to human and human to animal contact, which we discussed in the last video, is part of the reason we have all these plagues. Secondly, meat offered to idols. And third, blood. Fourth, eating strangled animals. As a side note, nowhere else in the Bible will you find the word strangled, but in those passages. These four things were practiced in pagan temples so avoidance differentiated Gentile converts and gave the Gentile converts a good start toward following the whole Torah. It's important to see that this verse is not licensed to ignore the other dietary laws regarding eating clean meats. How do we know this? Well, I'm glad you asked. The answer is in the very next sentence. Look at Acts chapter 15, verses 21. This seems like such a random verse, but it actually makes sense if you look at it from a Hebrew perspective. And I'll read it. For Moses has had throughout many generations those who preach him, meaning the law of Moses, in every city being read in the synagogues every Sabbath. So, although the Jerusalem brethren didn't want to burden the converts with too many details to start, they knew the converts would learn more about following the Torah as they sat in the synagogue every Sabbath, hearing the law of Moses being read. Eventually, the converts would be well versed enough to observe all the law of Moses. You know, this is sort of like when we lead a person to faith in Yeshua. We might start them off by suggesting they read their Bibles and quit sleeping around or doing street drugs. That doesn't mean that it's okay for them to lie and steal. It's just that we have to trust that their sanctification is a process as they hear more truth. So we should conclude with this passage that following the dietary law in the Torah still applies today. And the best defense that we have against plagues like coronavirus is to be Torah observant. I followed a mostly plant-based diet for decades with great results, and always felt that there was a day coming when people would have to quit eating meat because it was so toxic and dangerous to health. And that is exactly what's happening today. And it's beyond what I could have ever imagined could happen. I addressed the problem of our culture's propensity for eating unclean meat in my book, Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise, that I published back in 2008. It's presently out of print because the stats need to be updated, and the revised edition is finished, but it's taken a backseat to these videos, honestly. But I'll let you know when it's released. Again, I don't claim to be a Bible scholar. I just want to share the research and the things I come across so you can test it for yourself. And so that concludes this video, and I really have no idea what we're going to talk about next, but I want to remain flexible given what's going on all around us, but I do believe it will be good. So stay tuned. Shalom, friends.